So, welcome to Designing for Habit. Unleash the power of reward loops for irresistible user experiences with our man, the legendary Swede, Samuel Salzer, who is coming to us from Stockholm. What an alliteration you have given to us this morning, Sam. Thank you. So, just know we're Irrational Labs. We do three things. We do consulting, we do research, and we do training. You're obviously in the training space. Shay will be telling you a little bit about our corporate and bootcamp stuff as we go through the event. But this is the community work. So we have events every month that brings behavioral science nerds together into one place to discuss the most pressing, interesting, and enlightening topics in the field. That's why Sam's here. So, Irrational Labs has worked with hundreds of leading companies to create change using behavioral design. If we were superheroes, our origin starts with Google. We founded the behavioral economics business unit at Google and worked with 25 plus teams to embed BE all over their organization. We've run over 100 experiments, and we've worked with the top companies in the world. But speaking of top people in the world, most of you probably know Sam, I would bet. We probably need to put that link in the chat, but hopefully everybody here subscribes to Habit Weekly. If you don't, you're missing out. They use emojis better than any newsletter on the planet. Really, really great newsletter. So we will put that in the chat, but hopefully you subscribe to Habit Weekly. Sam will tell you more about it, but he is an applied behavioral scientist specializing in the intersection of product design and AI. He serves as a senior advisor to numerous leading tech startups and stands at the forefront of the emerging field of behavioral design. He's a frequent keynote speaker, and he co-authored Nudging in Practice, helping organizations make it easy to do the right thing. He's also the founder of Habit Weekly, the largest community for behavioral designers with the best use of emojis. So with that, if we could all give everybody Sam our best emojis to welcome him today, he's going to take over and enlighten everybody.
Thank you, Ryan. What a beautiful welcome. I feel really warmly welcome, which is nice because I'm in Stockholm, Sweden, and it's cold today. So really happy to be with you all and to together explore this interesting topic of habits. So I'm going to bring up my screen here and look forward to see which emojis you choose. I'm not going to force you to choose the last one you used. That could always be a little bit interesting. Ryan, are you speaking? I think you're muted.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say there's some high quality emojis there if you're catching them in the chat. People are really going all out for you, Sam.
Beautiful. Yeah, it's really nice to be here today. And yeah, let's get started. I already had a really nice intro, thanks to Ryan. I guess to say a little bit more, really my passion is to tackle the really hard behavior change problems in product design. So understanding how we can use the best in behavioral science to change behavior when it comes to the tricky behaviors like habit formation related behaviors, things that relates to oftentimes digital health, digital sustainability, and so on. And I've been very fortunate to be working with a lot of different product teams from around the world. And over the years have been able to kind of really try to make the science in behavioral science shine in practice. So really make things not only theoretically good, but also useful and practical and actually leading to some form of, long-term behavior changes. So that's what I hope to share with you all today, some of those lessons and insights. And kind of at the core of what I try to do is really, hopefully through this idea that if you want to change the world, you need to change behavior. And hopefully, what I try to do with the kind of challenges that I work on is oftentimes making habit changes. How do we change one good habit at a time effectively? And so as just a quick sample, I recently, for the last 2 years or so, have been kind of leading behavioral science effort at a wonderful company called Economy. They take financial data and convert that into carbon footprint data and kind of effectively give people an understanding of how their spending impacts the climate and the world. And so because of that, they've been ranked quite highly by Forbes as innovative company, and doing a lot of interesting things. And working with them was one of those fun challenges of how do we get 250 million people to go from having an awareness about their climate impact to actually changing their climate habits. So that's kind of the questions that I find super interesting to work on. While they're very hard, it's kind of really where you feel like you get to put your behavioral science to the test. So that's kind of an example of some of the things I work on. And before I jump into kind of the things I'm going to present today, I want to kind of have a little bit of primer where I want to ask you, what is a habit forming product? So take a few seconds or a moment to think about that question. Like, if you would try to answer this question, and you can answer it in the chat if you want to, but what is a habit forming product to you? Do you have any examples that come to mind? Is there a certain kind of characteristic or attribute that comes to mind? Think about that, maybe share in the chat. Yeah, because I think it's something we hear quite often, but what does it mean? What does it mean? So that is basically the goal of this session. The goal of this session is to provide maybe not all the answers to how to change any habit with a magic wand, but how to have a better nuanced understanding of habit forming products. So looking at a product challenge related to habits with a more nuanced lens. That's my main goal of today. So I see there's a lot of things coming in the chat. So it's really interesting to see what you guys are sharing. Okay, so basically, I'm going to start by framing the problem. I'm going to introduce perhaps a little more nuanced way of looking at habit forming challenges, and hopefully leave you with a little bit advice as well of throughout the session, kind of with some tidbits and good things to consider when it comes to designing products that changes behavior for good. So let's start by framing the problem. I'm sure a lot of people in this call will find themselves here, try to desperately kind of navigate this sea of product despair, battling against everything from leaky onboardings to drop-off rates and maybe failure states and so on and so forth. And it's not kind of surprising because, yeah, developing a product is really, really difficult. And some of the big, if this was some form of Moby Dick, the big whale will be something like churn maybe, because I often think that that's kind of one of the main things that, of course, conversions are great, but if people don't stay on, if engagement is low, if people drop off, why does it matter? What's the point? And so it's natural then to ask, like, how do we solve for this? How can we overcome this problem of, let's say, churn or intention action gap and attrition and so on? And perhaps the solution could be habits. So I think habit has been this kind of over the recent time seen as maybe that solution for kind of dramatically reducing churn over time. And to define habit, who better than the researcher that I think may have published the most, but maybe not, if not the most, some of the best recent work in the last decades on habit formation, Wendy Wood. So some key takeaways here in her definition is that it's a mental association between something in our context that cues a response. And as that repeats, it forms a connection between an action and a reward. So that's kind of the idea. And with the idea of habits, there's been a massive growth. So funny enough, there's a book that was published in 1890 by one of the, you can call it the OGs or goats of psychology, William James. And in that book, there was a lot of great ideas. But obviously, in the last decade or so, there's been a real spike in books on habits. And we learned that habits are not only, powerful, but they should be tiny, and they can be atomic, and so on and so forth. So you could say the habits are quite on kind of this very upward trajectory of being very interesting topic that everyone is kind of wanting to better understand. And it seems maybe quite simple to say, well, let's build more habits and it's going to be less churn. It's simple. It's just follow one of these books and everything is going to kind of solve for itself. But as maybe some of you guys have already experienced yourself, is that changing behavior is hard. If you've been at some of these talks before, I'm sure they've covered the idea of intention action gap, and that it's one thing to have intention, it's another thing to have action, and that gap can be quite wide. But think then about the habit gap, because to not only go from intention to action, to go to habit, you have to effectively repeat that action, let's say 30, 50, 100 times, depends on the behavior, but a lot of repetitions there. So that gap is massive. And then when we look at habit forming apps, and we realize that they don't really use habit science. So that makes the problem even worse, in that, okay, it seemed quite simple, but then suddenly we realize that habits are hard to change. And when we're trying to build habit forming apps, seemingly most of them are not really using habit science in doing so. So it's kind of where we find ourselves, in a place where kind of good intentions by users who want to change the behavior for good oftentimes are wasted with kind of subpar or not well supported solutions. So why does that happen? Let's look a little bit more into 4 core reasons for why most, I would say, habit interventions fail. And I want to start by now again going to you guys. If you had to predict what has the biggest impact in habit formation, and you can only kind of put your chips in one of these 4 squares, you could either bet on making the behavior easy, creating a supportive environment, having a consistent context, or ensuring the user have high motivation. If you only can ensure one thing for habit formation, where would you place your chips? Where would you vote? 1, 2, 3, or 4? Okay. This is awesome. And yes, when the wood is the best. I saw that comment now. And yeah, we see a lot of 2s and 3s, actually, in some ways, quite a bit of 4s as well. This is probably the time I've done this where I've seen the least amount of 1s, because given the fact that there are books on tiny habits and atomic habits and so on, a lot of people have that in their head that easy is good. But what one paper suggests is that the answer might be consistency. So trying to kind of compare these 4 things, it kind of highlights that, at least in this scenario, when it comes to gym goers in a longitudinal study, it seemed like consistency was the most important factor impacting habit formation. And kind of contrasting consistency with motivation, they say in their conclusion that our findings suggest that how, rather than why one practice, might be more important to forming habits. And that is actually quite a profound insight, specifically to habit formation, because it says that, again, why is important, but maybe not as important then as the time and place you do your habit. And I'm in Sweden, and I can tell you that fun fact is that 55% of Swedes eat tacos on Fridays. And it's Friday today, and I'm sure a lot of people right now are getting ready to prepare tacos. And it's a very random thing. Why Fridays? So about 15, 20 years ago, a grocery store here started to really promote this idea that Friday equaled cozy taco dinner with family, basically. And they really promoted this over and over again. And suddenly that connection started to set basically hold. And you suddenly, as a Swede, start to think Friday, tacos, Friday, tacos. So the consistency of that kind of connection to a day and a behavior really made tacos a big thing. And if you're in the US, you might be kind of perplexed into thinking like, why would you eat tacos on Friday? Clearly it's Taco Tuesday, for example. But that just speaks to this power of connecting a behavior to a consistent context. In this case, a day, but it could be kind of a time of day as well. And so, as another example with this, I have been using Duolingo quite a bit over the years, and one time I found myself with about 200-day streak. But the fun or embarrassing thing I noticed is when I looked at my streak, it looked similar to kind of this screenshot where it had these blue circles, and they represent streak freezes. Basically, that I actually missed my day, but Duolingo kind of kept the streak alive with like this fake streak support, basically. And I was asking myself, if I've done this for 200 days, why is there no habit in place? Why have I not been able to turn this language kind of practice into language learning habit? And I realized Duolingo never supported me really, or maybe I didn't do a good enough job in really connecting my language learning to a certain context. So sometimes I did my studying on the way to work, sometimes at lunch, sometimes in the evening, sometimes at breakfast, and so on. And I never really taught my brain of, just connecting this behavior to specific context, to not think and just do. And instead, my brain had to always question, should I do it here, there, what time? And that's really supported by this idea of implementation intention as well. Basically, that oftentimes one of the most impactful things you can do when deciding for habit formation and behavior change overall is really specifying what the user is expected to do, when and where. So basically supporting the user to create this internal model of what to do, when to do it, and where to do it. And that really becomes the cornerstone or like the foundation for what then can become a more automatic habit over time. So if you imagine your user having some form of internal habit statements, you really want to get them from going from something like this, where it's like, I want to allow myself space to meditate during the day, to something like, I will meditate using Headspace on weekdays at 12 for 10 minutes when it's my lunch break. So basically, that's kind of where we want to get towards. We want to make it so that the user is super, super clear in understanding in what context are we expected to be doing this behavior. And so that's the first fail, is to kind of trying to change behavior in terms of habit formation, but not thinking about the context and allowing for kind of this very unstable context situation. And if you're Duolingo, maybe that's why you have to then resort to kind of bribing people or taking people hostage to get them back. These are memes, by the way, that I think was created by Duolingo users. I can certainly relate to some of them. I think they're good fun, but also speaks to this idea that the importance of stable context is massive. Okay, next step, next fail. So fun fact is that the behavior, any behavior you basically do, obviously involves using the brain. And I use that as kind of a satirical thing, because if you look at the most common examples of like a cue, routine, reward illustration of like a habit loop, there's no cognition there. It just goes from cue to routine to reward, almost imagining that, again, there's nothing happening here. And it's true to a certain degree that once the habit is formed, there might not be too much of a step between cue and routine or action, because it's become automatic. But certainly that's not true before it's been formed. And even while it's formed, there's still stuff going on in this beautiful place between cue and routine. And so while the goal is automaticity, there's always this heavy cognitive component, at least initially. So imagining learning to drive, Of course, right now, if you're driving regularly, it might feel easy, automatic, but the first time, it would probably not that kind of experience for you. And conversely, if you're trying to disrupt a bad habit and helping users to kind of quit some kind of poor pattern of behavior, you actually really need to focus on cognition, because that's where you kind of start creating a space for awareness and reducing automaticity. So if you're Alex, which is this kind of smoking cessation app, what they mainly do is whenever someone clicks this kind of I'm craving for a cigarette, basically, they're prompting someone to think about, well, what's the situation? How are you feeling? What is kind of your physical symptoms? Really trying to get them aware of what is prompting them, what is the cue, what is their emotional states, really going back to some of the kind of cognitive behavioral therapy basics here. And that's a really important thing. If you're trying to disrupt the habit, you really need to drive this cognition element home. And so there's a lot of processes to consider beyond what I've said so far. Appraisal is a really important thing, expectations, so much we can talk about with decision making, obviously, mental models, and so on. But I think especially with appraisal is something that, again, I think is oftentimes neglected, where cues are not neutral. Everyone experiences a cue differently. So if the cue is the idea of kind of being in a social environment or seeing people around you, some people will be excited by that. They will give them some form of kind of positive emotions to kind of be experiencing this influx of people, or the idea of being surrounded with people. Another person could feel the opposite way, really feeling stressed, anxious, being prompted to really struggle with the idea of being kind of in this social context. And so appraisal of cues in itself is like one of the most important things that I've always would try to really dig into when I'm trying to design for habit formation. And so that's number 2. Habit fail number 2 is designing without cognition in mind, basically. Okay, another question for you fine folks here today. Which of these 3 apps would you consider the most habit forming? Tinder, Google Maps, or Duolingo? Which is the most habit forming? Yes. I think we have a pretty strong number 1 vote here. Let's see. I like there's some people that are trying to kind of be maybe a little bit, thinking differently and voting for Tinder or Duolingo, but clearly the Google Maps was the biggest vote winner here. And when we look at this, what I try to build on here is the idea that variable rewards are something we hear about often. So if you look at any habit kind of book or blog post or anything like that, the first thing you often see is the idea that variable rewards, and so on. And they certainly have their place. They can certainly boost motivation certain times. But I think it's at, this interesting kind of contradiction when it comes to where a lot of users will come to using your product or service, not really for variability, but to reliably remove pain, uncertainty, discomfort, any type of emotional states that they might want to escape from, for example. And they don't want to do that variably. They want to do that reliably. They want to do that every single time. And so, arguably the biggest motivator is this thing of finding ways to effectively escape pain. We talk about this in kind of behavioral science speak as negative reinforcement. So positive reinforcement is effectively adding something good. Negative reinforcement, removing something bad. And so if you think about drinking coffee, of course, there are positive reinforcement. It tastes good, for example. Hopefully you like it. It's well brewed. But arguably the bigger reason is that it reliably makes you less tired, for example. So negative reinforcement is really, really impactful in driving long-term behaviors. And, Google is arguably one of the most high-performing apps on your phone, but it has no variable rewards, no punishments. It's just really good at reliably removing uncertainty, or relatively reliably, or better than kind of competitors. And same is true for a lot of kind of apps in the health space that I'm in. I'm usually in digital health, and the apps you see that are kind of the biggest in the download chart on App Store is often ones that has to do with something where it gives people a little more control or sense of control of uncertainty in their life, whether that's understanding kind of what they eat and how it contributes to their kind of general health, or in the case of flow health, kind of their ovulation cycles and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the takeaway here. Fail number 3 is that you kind of focusing mostly on variable rewards when designing for habit formation. And I don't know if this is perfect, but I kind of created this basic, simple view of how to think about variable rewards, in that you should think about it as an ice cream where, you need to remove pain first. That's like a really important thing. You have to have a cone to really put some ice cream on. Then once you have that, you can think about, adding rewards as well. And then once you kind of understand how you can reliably do one of these two things or both, of course, then you can kind of consider how you can sprinkle in variability, and you can kind of find ways, especially long-term, make sure that the reward maintains rewarding as you're kind of repeating the behavior. But that's not something we focus on in the start. We're focusing on finding a really good understanding of our users in terms of what is causing them pain and how we can kind of like solve for that, and what can create a really rewarding experience. And a fun fact on rewards when it comes to habits is reward insensitivity. So you might have heard of this study. It's probably one of the most famous habit studies. And it's quite fun in the sense that in this study, they basically took a group of people, they gave them a chance to watch the film in the cinema, and they basically had in 2 conditions, if I remember correctly. They had one condition where they had fresh popcorn, and one condition where they had stale popcorn. And I believe it's not only stale in terms of like a few hours, I think it was a few days or maybe a week's stale popcorn. And what they noticed is that for people who had a strong habit of eating popcorn in the cinema, guess what? Didn't really matter that the popcorn was stale. Basically, they were insensitive to the reward of the popcorn because the habit was already in place. Basically, what this means is that actually, if someone has developed a really, really strong habit, there's actually a little bit less significance of kind of reward in that sense. So yeah, it's actually a really useful nuance to also understanding when it comes to habits, that rewards play a really interesting role, that they change, from when they start to be formed to once formed, they can actually become less important, for example. And I believe that this was by study was, I forgot to put in reference, but it's Wendy Wood, and yeah, I can link to it afterwards if you're curious, but it's a really interesting study. So that was the 3rd fail. And then it comes kind of like a fail of sort, which is that, breaking news is that if you have a user in your app, there's a huge chance that they will fail. Every user will fail in some capacity, depending on how you kind of define failure. But if it's to not use the app regularly, or use in the wrong ways, or X, Y, and Z, a lot of failure going on when it comes to changing behavior. At the same time, no one enjoys feeling, stupid, incompetent, confused. And I haven't trademarked this, but I kind of use it as kind of a fun, memorable term, in that if you think about your user experience, how many steps does it take for someone to achieve that they find a solution to their problem using your app? And how many steps does it take for them to feel stupid? sadly, for most products, users feel stupid way before they find a solution. And that's one reason why you see a lot of failure states or kind of churn as well. And if you look at, not too far away from here, Candy Crush was created here in Stockholm. And what they do quite well, and I think really understand, is that they basically need to protect people from failing in whatever way they can. And if you try to fail, you actually can't fail using their game. I think if you play the first 4 or 5 levels, whatever you do, it will take you to the next level, basically. You might not get the full points, but you're always going to progress. You're always going to feel like you're progressing. And I think that's a good reminder, because if you look at my kind of use for illustrative purpose graphs here, we really need to bridge this gap of a quickly decreasing motivation and a slowly increasing habituation, meaning that building habits takes a lot of time. Losing motivation can be drastic. Users can lose motivation very, very quickly. And so understanding that, we really need to kind of find ways to sustainably kind of get users back on track and kind of revive motivation as they're trying to build towards habituation. I think streaks are oftentimes the thing that is often used here. And of course, they can be valuable. They can be part of an effective kind of holistic solution. But I think more often than not, they're kind of this, basically something that kind of delays the inevitable. And you often see that, okay, because of the streak, people didn't churn after day 3, but once they lose the streak on day 7, they're gone. And now they will never come back because they have like this really strong aversion to kind of emotionally losing something, and maybe being held hostage in terms of like paying to get it back, for example. So what do we do? Well, this I could talk about for quite a lot of time, but basically we need to really try to map our failure states. And then once we map them, try to leverage strategies to both, you can call them maintenance strategies, or kind of preventative strategies to really ensure that the risk of failure is reduced, and then have strategies for recovering progress. And I think both of those things, there's so much that can often be done that is usually neglected. So much is focused on kind of the early part of getting people to kind of onboard, get started, but so much less is used when it comes to behavioral science within kind of mapping failure states and using strategies for kind of getting people back on track if they fail. So that was fail number 4. So I don't know what you guys, but doesn't this feel like a little bit of a sad mess that there's so many fails, and it seems like we're none the wiser for all of the books that has been written on habits? And if I were to blame something, I would probably blame something like this. These kind of like underwhelming models that are overly simplistic in trying to help us understand habits. And so if we look at these models from kind of the lens of what we would cover here, we realize that, not much talk here is about the context and the stable and consistency of contexts in terms of cues. Nothing is talked about here when it comes to cognition and appraisal, for example, or kind of understanding what's going on in the brain. And then when we come to reward, nothing about reward insensitivity, very little about negative reinforcements. And what about the failure states? Very little there as well. And so as I'm going to kind of wrap up now, I wanted to hopefully kind of admit that we can do better and hopefully allow for a little bit better version of this. So give you maybe a bit better way to look at habit formation in specifically digital products. Because these kind of simple loops are kind of what you could call pigeon loops. They come from research based off Skinner and others, where they basically put pigeons in boxes and then had a really, really simple way of understanding how the cue and action reward cycle connected. And if you look at Wendy Wood, how she views habit formation. This is just 2 illustrations. You quickly get the understanding that there's so much more going on here. There's a lot of more complexity. And that's kind of something that we really have to admit, that whatever that is simplified to this degree is probably selling you kind of a little bit of snake oil, in that habit formation is really hard and complex. So still though, I hope to provide you with a slightly more complex loop, but still one that can help you maybe see habit formation with a better kind of lens in your products. And to explain that, I just need to explain that when I think about in-app behaviors, I basically would categorize them in kind of 2 broad categories. So either funnels or loops, in that there's some behaviors in apps that are kind of one-time behaviors and some that are more recurring. And if you look at something like a behavior matrix from Noom, you might have some form of primary outcome that you want to support users in losing weight. They might have some form of metrics that you try to measure in terms of what are their KPIs. But then they will have some form of funnels and loops. They will have a sign-up funnel, onboarding funnel, and they will have maybe, let's say, a weigh-in loop. They maybe have a code check-in loop. They might have a kind of content loop in form of like kind of reading something every day, and so forth. So for Noom, their loops here are obviously quite important to understand. Like, how well does the weigh-in loop operate? Does it kind of reliably function well? Does it lead to the KPIs that they want to, and so forth? So loops are important. And if you think about core loops as like a kind of even more defined version of this, is really the loops in the user experience that are kind of key to the user, both engaging in the way that is kind of expected, but also receiving the kind of the value that you hope to bring them. And so oftentimes when I work on products, it's basically this, like, how can we design really, really effective core loops in the products? And so basically I want to kind of give you is same, but different. So something similar that you've seen, but maybe with a little bit more nuance. So if you look at kind of this version of call it a core loop, it's kind of similar to what you've seen before. There's still a queue. Suddenly though, there's a little bit cognition here as well, but still behavior or routine, same thing. Here, small distinction in that instead of reward, we talk about experience, because again, we can think about not only creating reward, but also removing pain and so on. So experiences are quite complex and could be entailing a lot of things. So beginning there, that gives us a little bit better starting point to kind of work with. And so if we're kind of looking at a core loop from Uber, we can then think about, okay, what's the queue? Maybe someone wanted to get from point A to point B. What's their cognition? Here we can dive in again, really deeply now into some more processes. What is the behavior? And then what is the reward? Like, what is kind of happening at the end of this? What is the experience looking like? But there's one interesting thing that I think is very rarely covered, but maybe is the most important. And that is what I would call meta experiences, or between loop changes. Effectively, if someone does, go from cue, cognition, behavior, experience, that's the first time to do it. But then that's going to change a lot of things. And I think that is something that's actually profoundly interesting, in that, for example, if you've never been to a place to drink coffee, but you decide to go there, you feel tired, you decide to go to this new coffee place, you have expectations that it's going to solve your problems, and then it's going to be kind of affordable or tasty. You go there, you eventually find the place, you have some form of positive experience. Well, that's going to change the next time you go there. It's going to go from, you feeling tired to more quickly, for example, think about coffee and think about this place. Suddenly, maybe expectations will be higher the second time around, because first time you had a really good experience, for example. And as you repeat this, you see that it's an ever-changing thing. And it becomes really, really interesting then when you really think about this concept. It's one of the way of thinking about it is from Bandura, which is called reciprocal determinism, in that these kind of meta experiences between loop changes can either create this kind of downward spiral or upward spiral in the behavior. Either it becomes a really rewarding spiral or it becomes a punishing one. And that's a really, really, really fun thing to nerd into and really try to understand. So again, if we look at Uber, we would expect that over time, if they provide the value that they hope, you know, there will be stronger internal cues. You will start connect, looking for, you know, thinking about how you can get from point A to point B, or feeling uncertain about how to get somewhere, to think about the Uber app. You will feel less uncertainty because you feel more confidence in that Uber will solve your problem. You obviously, it'll be easier because you've done this before, so you can kind of like become more adept to using the app. You will have favorite destinations saved, so that will make it easier as well. You might actually notice the notification better on your phone because you kind of know what to look for and kind of associate the cues with kind of this solution. And you might have an increasing interest in kind of exploring other loops within Uber, whether that's Uber Eats or something else. So a lot of things happen, a lot of things are going on. And so, you know, adaptive core loops will also then change probably. And so whatever happens in day 1 will probably look different in day 7 and day 30 and so on. Yeah, so that's kind of probably the big last question, is to think about, maybe after this, is to think about what are the core loops within your product and service, and what does your user data say? Do you have any user data that you collected to say whether they are reliably rewarding? In the case of this, like, how certain are we that someone completes the day 1 loop? And if they complete the day 1 loop, how confident are we that they complete the second one, the third one, and what changes between them, and so on. And then I'll just leave the screen here. I won't go through all these things. But again, my goal was not here today to give you the simple answers, but hopefully give you better questions to ask. When you're thinking about high-performing products, now having a little more deeper questions when you look at some form of loop for your apps or products, hopefully now you can think about and ask about some of the more things that a little more nuanced model will allow for. And yeah, I'll leave this screen here as well. If you want to take some screenshots or something, can probably find a way to share that as well afterwards. But basically, if you want to do like a really quick loop audit, some good questions to ask is, first of all, do people fail to start a behavior? Well, then probably there's something to do with the cues that you want to maybe understand better, something to do with expectations relating to, you know, how people think about doing the behavior, or also think about the reward they might expect to receive from doing the behavior. Do people start the behavior but not finish it? Well, it's probably complexity of the behavior that I might want to consider, maybe skill or knowledge, maybe that is not enjoyable, maybe time or opportunity, environment, and so on. And lastly, do people kind of complete it but don't repeat it? Effectively, they don't come back to repeat the loop. And obviously you can look at all these things again, but also you can look at, you know, how do people actually value the rewards? Can we layer more rewards? Can we consider if there's something like a negative consequence of the behavior, maybe socially, maybe they actually feel alienated if they do what they're expected to do. They feel embarrassed somehow, for example. Or can we maybe improve the perceived value of doing the behavior? So that's some of the really, really, really quick things that you could start asking yourself to start maybe finding some more answers to some of these things. So yeah, that's it. We made it back to square one. I don't know what your answer now is to kind of what is a high-performing product, but I hope that you now have a little bit better grasp of at least understanding that there's so much more here maybe than you thought to really look into and explore and really be curious about. And really, when you go back to doing your user research, you know, really going back there with maybe some more questions and some more kind of ways to really dig into the loops you see in your products. So yeah,
Thank you
that's
so much,
basically
Sam.
it. Yeah.
No, that's spectacular. And we'll put your LinkedIn in the chat. We do have a nice list of questions for you.
Cool.
I'm going to ask people to kind of come off mute in order as you are in the Google Docs. So Sharon, Pooja, Wes, Lynn, Ed, and then Ed has two. And then somebody else is getting a exciting question there. Their name is right now Anonymous Liger. With that, I have a quick question though for you before we begin, Samuel. This is a critical question. Where are you getting those wonderful little animations that you're using all across the presentation?
Depends. You mean like
Yeah,
these
like
ones?
that. Yeah.
I think that's Pitch. Some of them are from Pitch. Some of them are created by me or my partner. My partner's a designer, so that helps. So actually, maybe I should give a shout out to her as well. But before we take questions, I just want to give a shout out to Chris York, because he's one of those people that I would always say, if you want to learn more about, reward loops, perfect person to learn from. Together with him, I've been fortunate to be involved with bsci.org. He has a great resource there. So bsci.org, I can link to it as well. Check that out. Irrational Labs, you guys do some really great work when it comes to understanding these things. And also Kristen's product teardowns is, I think, a really good place to get into some of this nitty-gritty stuff when it comes to habit forming products. So you just wanted to say that before I leave the screen.
Well, that's excellent. Yeah, we'll share that Substack. It is very popular. So thank you. So Sharon, Sharon in Seattle, bring us our first question.
Hey, Samuel, great to meet you. I'm a big fan, been following you on LinkedIn, get your newsletter. This was fascinating. My question is this: what are the dimensions of context that must be present for that initial behavior loop, or that initial start of a habit formation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So usually what we try to think about is kind of this 3 dimensions of context. So one, kind of the space, like where is the person during that time of starting the behavior. Second, what is the time? What is the kind of temporal landmark of sort? What is the time aspect? And then thirdly, what action kind of precedes doing the behavior? And so depending on the situation, we might actually focus on one of those 3 contexts more. So if there's someone who is, for example, let's say you specifically develop a product for people who happen to be traveling all the time and always happen to be in different physical context, well, then maybe you try to focus a little more on the time aspect of like helping them make sure that they do the behavior at the same time every day, or after doing something that they already do, like brushing their teeth or something like that. So the context of those things can vary, but I think that's the main 3 things that I would consider.
Great, thank you. That was helpful. Really appreciate it.
Cool,
Excellent.
thanks.
No, thank you. So Pooja in India, are you able to come on the mic?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Hi, Samuel. This was a lovely session. Thank you so much. My question for you is basically based on a product that I was working on, which was a weight loss coaching product. My question is basically, what are some of your suggestions to ensure that a user doesn't feel judged when we're asking for check-ins or things that they've done for the day? And just to ensure that, no judgment, because one of the things that you mentioned was we talk about the CBT model. How do we still gather information about their feelings, about their environment, but just ensuring that they're not feeling judged? Because this has been a challenge for us to crack, because people are enjoying being on the product, or rather using the product, but adherence in terms of habit check-ins, in terms of talking about their stress levels or sleep levels, is something that people are quite apprehensive to really log in their data. So what are some of your suggestions for that to ensure that they're motivated as well?
Okay, great question. So maybe first thing would be to ensure the framing is set up in a way that kind of frames it as something that benefits them, but is done for their best interests, rather than, I think sometimes it's kind of can be easily confused when you're asked in a product to kind of give some form of information. It's easy to think that I'm doing this for the product instead of it doing it for me, really. And so really making it really clear, and maybe having some form of like opt-in way to ensure that, you know, you like, do you want to have better results? Learn more about, you know, do you want us to help you better understand your, you know, context or whatever thing you're challenging with? Having that as an opt-in could then lead to them probably perceiving it more positively. So I think that's kind of a starting point. Then in terms of asking questions, I think there's so much great resource within motivational interviewing in terms of how to effectively kind of communicate with users, both in person, but also through digital products in kind of a onboarding setting or in a kind of survey setting and stuff like this, where I think motivational interviewing, if there's so much resources if you look into that space. So that I think is a really useful space to look into. And then, yeah, what else would I say about specifically this stuff? Well, just be maybe mindful that, you know, this idea of tracking burden effectively, that, you know, sometimes we forget that when we have a digital product, it's very hard to avoid actually not making kind of the life of the user harder by, let's say they wanted to go to the gym and they download the gym app. Well, now not only have to go to the gym now, but they also likely in the app have to track every time they go to the gym and have to say what they did in the gym. And they have to, you know, so suddenly not only do they have to actually go to the gym, but also do all of these things in the app. And so I think it's also a little bit this balance of not asking too much of the users in general.
Just a follow-up question to that is, in terms of motivational interviewing is already being done by our coaches, and even gathering data about physical activity, etc., is being done via the devices like, you know, the Ring, as well as the Apple Watch or Fitbit, based on the users who have those devices, right? That's enough data for us. But however, I think that lag that we're having is where we want the users to check in as well, because the amount of data for us to analyze at the end of a week and to have those check-ins is becoming slowly challenging because not everybody has a device. So any other suggestions besides motivational interviewing? Or are you saying that motivational interviewing as a concept, we can use those questions and on our product where we could sort of, you know, bring in more engagement?
Yeah, I guess it depends. But I guess one more thing that I would add as a really useful thing to look into here is called abstinence violation effect. It's kind of a little bit obscure psychological phenomena. It's more, I've been exposed to working a lot with smoking and drinking cessation. So how to help people to stop drinking and smoking. So this effect basically comes into play where someone has made a commitment to stop doing something, let's say stop drinking, stop smoking, or it could also be like start going to the gym, start eating healthy. And then they break that commitment in some way. They don't go to the gym, they eat something unhealthy and so on. And they have to report that to someone. They have to tell someone that I'm no longer sober. I had a pizza instead of a salad. That is a quite painful thing to do. And so reporting these kind of things can be quite hard for people to do. And talking about failure states, huge likelihood of failure state if there's this kind of risk of that. So looking into that effect and learning about more. I can speak more about it, but I think we have maybe other questions. But the abstinence violation effect is really interesting to look into.
Yeah.
Great. I'll check that out.
Thank you so much, Pooja. Wes, so let's see how your mic goes.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Sam, for this presentation. I just wondered if you had any recommendations for potential or good ways of measuring the diminishing sensitivity of rewards for specific user types.
Cool. Can you speak a little bit more? I'm curious what you're looking at.
Well, just it was a new concept to think that rewards would actually have diminishing sensitivity, but in terms of like having some sort of a feedback loop so you can identify when the rewards you're presenting are actually having less effect on those users.
Yeah, so the simplest way, and usually the way that's is done in research, is that you basically just test what happens if you remove the reward. Are people more or less likely to repeat the behavior? Sometimes there are cases where actually like removing rewards can increase likelihood of repetition because maybe the rewards over time is not that meaningful anymore, and it just kind of becomes an extra screen to go through, for example. So that's usually how it's done, is to kind of just play around with like taking away rewards and seeing people if they care, if they noticed, if they react to it, for example. And yeah, I think that would be the main way to do it. Then, yeah, if we would look at other ways, I would have to know a little bit more about what kind of rewards you have in your product and the type of user groups that you're looking at.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Lynn, let's see if we can squeeze your question in quickly.
Oh, thank you, Ryan. So I have a feeling, Samuel, that you're going to maybe answer this question going back to this concept of reporting. But my question was like, if you don't have a device or an app to support or control those loops, what kinds of things can you do? And so I'll, listening to your answer about reporting, I'll say, well, what if you don't have an ongoing thing, right? So if someone's going to a program like a Weight Watchers, right, then they could report, right? But what if you're, just doing one-off classes or workshops, let's say you're trying to teach like count to 10 before you respond to something, right? Would reporting to themselves work, or what ways could you encourage sort of well-being habits where there isn't an app or a device or someone to report to?
Yeah, that is definitely some of the challenging ones. And I guess that's where you have to, I guess, explore ways of doing user research to kind of uncover some of these things. But it definitely can be tricky, and also depends on your kind of user research budget. If you have the luxury of having a big budget, you could do like, following user at home and do some form of like ethnological research, but oftentimes that's not really possible. And so there's different levels, I guess, to doing user research. And so maybe you can at least try to pull out maybe 10 or 15 users to interview or to kind of talk to and so on. Because I agree with you, sometimes it can be very suboptimal to kind of both provide people with a solution and then also force people to kind of report every time they do it and how they're doing it, so on. It can be kind of frustrating for people. So yeah, I would then focus a little more on, how can we find a creative way to kind of capture some kind of way of doing user research sprint to kind of gather some of those insights.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sam. Well, it has been a pleasure. If everybody could again drop an emoji to show your love for Sam in Sweden, which this never stops being fun to say. But it was a joy to have you with us here today. Remember, we did post Sam's website, his LinkedIn, Habit Weekly, all in the chat, as well as some incredible things that Irrational Labs offers. So we hope to see you here next month. And Sam, thanks again for your time and energy tonight. It means a lot to all of us.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. And I really want to say thank you guys for all of the things you do. I think it's really important to have, a space for talking about product and behavioral science and all the good stuff. So thank you, Irrational Labs. You are awesome. And thanks everyone for joining. It was really nice meeting you.
Awesome. All right, everybody, take care. Have a brilliant Friday or Saturday.